Hey everybody, I'm JJ Johnson. Welcome to the American Prepping Academy. Today we are going to talk about Prepper Radio Communications 101. This is probably the most in-depth lesson that we've done so far, so you might want to buckle up or maybe just sit down and go grab a drink because it's going to take a little bit to get through this one. Okay, so for the overview on this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about the lesson's intent, kind of what I'm trying to do with this. And then we're going to talk some about radio wave basics, how a radio works, basic radio terminology, radio frequency ranges, how radio waves travel differently, radio wave propagation, line of sight, repeaters, types of radio bands for preppers, using handheld radios, some common radio use mistakes, the 333 radio plan or the Prepper radio plan, some Prepper and Militia radio frequencies, direction finding, and jamming. Okay, so the lesson's intent here. This lesson's designed to basically provide a new prepper with some basic information on how handheld radios work and what their limitations are so that they have a realistic understanding of a handheld radio's capability and how they can be employed during disaster situations. This lesson is not an in-depth tutorial on the details of radio intricacies, and it also does not address amateur radio or ham radio specifics. Though ham radio may also be a good option for preppers, it's not within the scope of this mission. There's just a lot to cover in the ham radio section, so we'll try to do that at a later date. But we're just talking about the basics here. All right, so for radio wave basics, a radio wave is defined as an electromagnetic wave having a wavelength between 1 millimeter and 30,000 meters, or a frequency between 10 kilohertz and 300 gigahertz. So, and when you think of waves, you can actually think just kind of like a wave, like in water. It's similar kind of thing, but but different. All right, so with frequency, it's how many cycles per second the radio wave makes. So if we look over here at this little diagram here, we've got 1, 2, 3 peaks in this 1 second period. So that would be a 3 hertz cycle. Hertz is the international unit of measure for the frequency of radio waves. So if you hear someone saying, 300 gigahertz or whatever, they're talking about the speed of that wave within a second. Okay, wavelength. Wavelength is the distance between successive crests of a wave, especially points within an electromagnetic wave, like we're talking about here. So that's going to be, if you look down here, you can see it, the length from the same point on the wave. Generally, most people would measure from either the crest up here to here or the trough from here to here. So that distance is the wavelength. That'll become important later when we're talking about handheld radios and knowing how they'll do in different environments. Okay, now the amplitude of the radio wave is also helps to determine the signal strength of the wave, and that is basically the height of the wave. So if you look here on this one, if you measured from the center line to the top of this wave, that would be your amplitude, and it's essentially equivalent to the signal strength. So if this wave's amplitude was up here higher, then it would be a stronger wave. All right. So the carrier wave. Most people have heard of AM and FM radio. The big difference between AM and FM radio is the carrier wave that they both use. So AM is better at transmitting voice at long distances, and FM is more clear and has more fidelity to it, which is why it's usually used for music. So when we look at the wave style here, you can see with an AM wave, what they do is they modify the wave to increase or decrease the modulation. Remember we were talking about the modulation is the height of the wave. So, excuse me, the amplitude. So they increase the height of the wave, and then they decrease it, and then they increase it, and they decrease it, and so on. And that's how they send the signals so that the radio knows, what to play. With frequency modulation, or FM, what they do is they change the frequency. So you can see here the number of cycles per second is really high, and then they slow it down, and then it gets really high again. And so the radio will then interpret those waves, to transmit it into sound. So that's the basic difference between AM and FM. It's just a carrier wave, and it's the method that which they send the information over the waves. Okay, so this is just another little graphic that kind of helps to reaffirm or explain what we've just been talking about. Like I said, if you drop a pebble into water, it's going to cause these waves, and these waves are kind of similar to radio waves in that when they start out, they're pretty strong, and then as they go out further, they start to get a little bit weaker. Here's an example of how a wavelength changes over time. At the beginning, at the starting point over here, we can see it's real consistent. As we start to go down the line, we see that the wavelength starts to stretch out. Okay, so that is why radios will only work for certain distances, because the frequency, or excuse me, not the frequency, but the wavelength basically phases out. So then we have this is just in a kind of a contained container here, and if you are using a radio within a certain space that you know that you can keep that same wavelength, then it's gonna operate clearly. So just, I don't know if that makes enough sense to you guys or not, but I thought it made a little bit of sense to me in kind of showing how the wavelength can change over time. Okay, so how a radio works. So as a person takes their voice and they speak into the radio, and this is a real simplified version of this, but the voice is changed into a radio signal, then the radio signal is transmitted out of the antenna via a radio wave, and that's on that specific frequency. Then the other radio in the communication, the antenna picks up the received message, changes it back into voice, and then you hear it come out, through the speaker. So the reason that is important is just so that you understand the importance of the radio waves and how they operate. And we're going to dive a little deeper into this in the next coming slides. Okay, so some basic radio terminology. Bandwidth is the amount of frequency space occupied by a radio signal. If you remember, we just talked about wavelength, and so there is some variance in the wavelength, and that means that a radio is going to have a certain degree of bandwidth that it can operate on because it's not entirely consistent over different distances. So you've got to have some space, within, with which to operate in. Okay, channel, the frequency on which radio transmission takes place, or the input and output frequency pair used by a repeater station. And we'll talk a little bit more about repeaters as well. Dead zone is a region where a radio signal cannot be received due to propagation difficulties. Direct is to communicate with another station without using a repeater. And direct communication, and or we'll see here in a second, simplex communication is probably what most preppers are going to be using. Then we've got direct wave, is a radio signal propagated via line of sight. That is also the way in which most preppers are going to use radios. Then we have duplex. So this is to transmit on one frequency while listening for replies on another. And that is how repeaters work. They work in a duplex mode. As we said a minute ago, hertz is one complete cycle of a radio wave per second. An input frequency is the frequency on which a repeater station listens for signals to retransmit. The ionosphere is an electrically charged region of the Earth's atmosphere located approximately 40 to 400 miles above the Earth's surface that refracts and absorbs radio signals. And this will become important a little later as well when we talk about skipping and things like that. Okay, now line of sight. Line of sight is communication between two radio stations that are in visual sight of one another. Line of sight might be the most important thing to understand about handheld radio communications. All right, so a couple more definitions here. Repeater is a radio station that receives other stations on a certain frequency and simultaneously retransmits them on another frequency. The output frequency is the frequency on which a repeater station will retransmit signals it hears on its input frequency. Overloading is when a strong signal in a frequency range interferes with the proper operation of a receiver, creating false ghost signals on various frequencies in the frequency range. We'll talk about that when we get down to jamming. Then you have a phonetic alphabet, which is a standard set of words used to represent letters in the alphabet, sort of like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and so on. Propagation is the process of how a radio signal travels from a transmitting station to a receiving station. Some frequencies and wavelengths behave a little bit differently. Simplex is to transmit and receive on the same frequency. And transceiver is a combined transmitter and receiver sharing a common housing and many of the same components. And that would be what you would normally think of as like a normal walkie-talkie or any radio that both transmits and receives. Okay, so let's talk about radio frequency ranges, the spectrum of frequencies. If we start over here on the left, you can see that you've got VLF. That's very low frequency. So you want to think of those waves as being big, slow waves. And you can kind of remember that because it's used for maritime radio navigation. Same thing with low frequency. Military uses these frequencies and stuff as well. And then we move into the medium frequency range and the HF or high frequency range, and those are used for aviation navigation as well as AM radios. And if you've ever heard airplanes talking on your AMF or your AM radio, that's because they are in a similar range. Okay, so the three, if you see these three shaded here, these are the three that preppers are primarily going to be concerned with. Again, not entirely, but pretty much, the vast majority of it is going to be the HF or high frequency, the VHF or very high frequency, and the UHF or ultra high frequency. Then to the right of those, we have super high frequency and extreme high frequency. Those are used for microwave transmissions, satellites, those kinds of things, and even cell phone communications and that kind of thing. Okay, so the interesting thing about HF, VHF, and UHF is that they're all named high frequency, right? And so when you hear high frequency, you might think that that is not a low frequency. But within the spectrum of what we're talking about, it is actually the lowest frequency. And so the wavelength is the longest. And then you get to VHF, which is a little bit shorter on the wavelength and a little higher on the frequency. And then you get to UHF, which is even shorter on the wavelength and higher on the frequency. So you might also have heard radio bands spoken of within meters, and this is where that comes in. The HF or high frequency band is from basically 100 meters to 10 meters, and that length is the wavelength of the signal. Then for VHF you have from 10 meters to 1 meter, and then for UHF you have from 1 meter to 10 centimeters. So you can see that the wavelength varies greatly between these three bands. You're going from 100 meters on the low side of the HF range all the way up to 10 centimeters on the UHF range. Okay, and then the spectrum for these three ranges is about 3 megahertz all the way up to 3 gigahertz. Okay? All right, now let's talk a little bit more about frequency ranges. The important thing to know about wavelengths is that the longer the wavelength, which means the lower the frequency, like the high frequency band. I understand this can get kind of confusing. So hopefully the slides will help make it more clear. They tend to do better without obstructions, and they can skip off the ionosphere to obtain greater distances with lower power. Now, the shorter wavelength frequencies, or the really high frequency bands like the VHF and UHF, tend to do better in areas with significant obstructions, but they will have significantly less range, and they tend not to skip off of the ionosphere but actually penetrate it. So over here on this right, this is an example of like a cell tower network, which is in the UHF range or maybe slightly higher. And so with these signals, you can see that they'll bounce off of buildings. These frequencies that have a higher frequency and the shorter wavelength, they bounce off of buildings better. Okay, and the reason that we want to know this, the reason we want to talk about this, and it's again over here in this in this range where the waves are moving pretty fast. They've got a pretty quick frequency here. They're tight together. Is because we want to understand how the wavelengths work so that we can select the best radio for us based off of the terrain and the environment that we live in. So if we live in a urban area and we're primarily going to be using radios in an urban area, then you're probably going to want to get something in the UHF range. That's probably going to work a little bit better for you. If you are living in a more open area, then you might want to get something in the HF range or the VHF range. And the VHF is kind of in the middle, so it kind of might work in kind of all situations. But again, it's just important to understand these basics for the radio selection that you decide to get. And we'll cover this a little bit more when we get into each specific type of band. Okay, here's another example of what I was talking about with how the radio waves travel differently. If we start over here, we'll talk about like the HF range, the high frequency range, which is a low frequency, and we can see here this tower is transmitting another to another tower. And what happens is the radio signal goes up and it bounces off the ionosphere and then it comes back to the tower. And that helps the tower achieve a greater range, especially if it was past the radio horizon, and we'll talk about that in a second. With VHF signals or higher frequency signals, what happens a lot of times is one of two things. Either if the power is high enough, then it's probably going to just go right through the ionosphere, and so you don't ever get a skip. In certain conditions, if the conditions are right, then you can get a skip off of the higher atmosphere, but that is it's not as common, especially for smaller radios and things that you're going to use in prepper communications. That's really going to be in more commercial kind of applications. So over here on the right, here's another diagram that kind of explains a little bit better the difference in how the radio waves react on terrain and how they follow terrain. So if we look at this green line, that's the UHF, okay? And so that's going to be your higher frequencies, and it's going to be a very short wavelength. And what happens is UHF does not do a great job of following terrain. See how it stops right here at the beginning? It doesn't do, even though it'll bounce off buildings and stuff like that pretty good, it doesn't do a great job of following the terrain. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then with VHF, you get a little bit better job of terrain following aspect to it. And then UHF is even better. But again, like I was saying a minute ago, with the HF, if the conditions are right, then you can also skip off of that ionosphere and then reach that receiver on the other side of this big terrain feature. So I hope that makes sense. But essentially, we're just trying to understand the way that radio waves behave. Okay, here is another look at radio wave propagation. There are some factors that affect radio wave propagation. The curvature of the Earth is a big one. The shape of the Earth will naturally keep radio waves from reaching their intended destination. And we can see that explained kind of right here. If we look at the curvature of the Earth, we can see up here that, from if it was totally flat, a totally bald Earth with nothing, no terrain or anything, generally the radio horizon or the optical horizon is going to be about 3.7 miles. And that's to the point to where you can kind of, see the horizon basically. And again, we'll go into this a little more in future slides. And then once your radio wave travels past that, there's going to be a radio shadow area, and then the other receiver on the other end of this at about another 3.47 miles would be able to pick up that signal again. Again, that's all because of the curvature of the Earth. And so the combined radio horizons are equal about 6.94 miles, about 7 miles. And that, in the best case scenario, best case scenario, without getting any kind of a skip off of the ionosphere or anything, is going to be the farthest distance that you're generally going to get with just a handheld radio. And I will also say, if you do get that distance, you're doing really good, because most of the time it's significantly shorter than that because of all the obstructions. So a lot of times in stores you see these little GMRS and FRS radios that say 35 miles. Well, that is a theoretical distance, basically from transmitting, from a mountaintop to somebody out on an ocean somewhere or something like that. It's not a realistic figure at all. So that's important to know. Okay, so we also have, obstructions, trees, buildings, hills, etc. Those kind of things will stop radio waves and cause them to bounce and degrade. We also have the antenna, how well the antenna is tuned or matched to the transceiver, and how high the antenna is off the ground. That is important to know, so that when you're using handhelds, if you can get to high ground, it'll definitely help the range that you're going to receive. Now, wattage is the amount of power that the transceiver pushes out of the signal. And again, the wattage is going to help boost that out a little bit further. Similar, so it's going to just basically help push that out a little bit further. So the last thing is then we have atmospheric conditions. And atmospheric conditions, as a general rule, radios will tend to work a little better on clear nights and have less interference. They are, clouds and rain and solar activity can also affect the radio performance as well. We're not going to go too much into the ionosphere, but essentially the ionosphere has a couple of bands where at night those bands tend to kind of go away, which allows radio signals to skip off of the ionosphere a little bit easier in the evening and night. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about line of sight. Like I said, line of sight is hugely important, especially in handheld communication. And this is just a picture that kind of depicted it pretty good, so I threw it in here. Let's say that you are standing up on top of this hill and you're trying to transmit down to this house. You've got a clear line of sight. There's not going to be any problems with that, okay? As long as you're within the range of the radio, you shouldn't have any issues with that. Now, over here, if you were trying to transmit to somebody down here in this little town or whatever, you might have some problems. With the way that line of sight works, if you can't see where you're transmitting, this is a real simple explanation, then you're probably not going to get to them. The reality of that is a little bit different, but and we'll talk about that in just a second. But as a general rule, you want to try to be in a position that's going to allow you to see where you're transmitting to, if you can. Now, the reality of the situation is that this radio signal probably wouldn't hit these guys over here on this right-hand side, but it probably would, in reality, hit maybe this guy here at the end of the house. And let me just show you this next slide here. It's called line of sight radio shadow, or dead zone. So if you have one transmitter here and another transmitter over here, and there's a big terrain feature in between the two, then the radio waves are going to be stopped by this terrain feature, and then behind it there's going to be the radio shadow where it's not going to be able to hit. And that's why I was saying on this here, we might have a situation where you're not going to get any reception here, but you might further out, depending. Okay, so it's important to understand this so that if you have a big terrain feature in between you and the person you're trying to talk to, you may want to get up there on that hill, and then you're going to have better luck. Okay, so line of sight. So this is the reality of line of sight and how it actually works. So the first thing is that you're going to have your optical horizon. That's the horizon that you see as you stand on the ground. Now, line of sight in this range is going to be really good. As you can see, it's a nice solid arrow here. You're not going to have any problems. If you can see your target, it's going to work good, most likely. And then you have from the optical horizon to the radio horizon. And that is just past your line of sight because radio waves, like we were showing earlier, tend to try to follow the ground level as to a certain degree. Then you have the non-line of sight region, which is where you're going to start to see significant degradation as the radio waves continue to propagate. And so that's pushing out at the extreme limits of where your handheld's going to go. So, you can transmit further than you can see, but you just have to understand that the further you get out, the more degradation you're going to experience. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about repeaters here. We'll start with handhelds. Okay, so handhelds generally transmit in simplex. You can see you're on a radio, you're talking to a car or to another person, you're transmitting on 146.52, and they're receiving on 146.52. And you can't talk at the same time because you'll step on each other. And that's a simplex transmission. Okay, and that's what we're going to use the majority of the time. Now, a duplex transmission is where you have transmission on, like, let's say 147.720, and then the repeater sitting up on the hill here is going to receive that transmission, and they're going to change it over to a different frequency, and they're going to send it back out on 147.120 to this other person. And then when they transmit, they'll transmit on the same frequency that you did, and then they'll send it back out on the 147.120 to you. So that's duplex transmissions. And the reason that we have repeaters is because we've got a lot of terrain features and stuff like that. And so in order to, because we don't have just a big flat earth, like on this picture up here, the reality is there's a lot of terrain. And so they put repeaters up to get around this. And what those repeaters do is take those signals and then they send them back out, so that people at further distances away can hear. Okay. All right, we're getting into the good stuff here. 28 minutes in already. Okay, types of radio bands for preppers. This is a good section here. Talking about the different types. We've got the Family Radio Service, or FRS. We have the General Mobile Radio Service, or GMRS. Then we have the Multi-Use Radio Service, or MURS. Then we've got the NOAA Weather Radio, which you can't transmit on, but it's good to listen to. Then we've got the Citizens Band, which is CB. And then we have the Amateur Radio Service, which is the ham radio. And again, all of these frequencies fall within those three bands that I was telling you about earlier: HF, VHF, and UHF. Okay, so for the Family Radio Service, there are 22 channels that range from the 462 megahertz to the 467 megahertz. That is in the UHF band. The wavelength is approximately 64 centimeters, and it uses a frequency modulation carrier wave, the FM carrier wave. It can transmit voice and data. It's authorized by the FCC to transmit voice and data. And now all channels are shared with GMRS. That's a fairly recent change. No license is required, and it can be used for personal or business use. The wattages are authorized from 0.5 watts up to 2 watts. That's also a change. It used to be all just 0.5 watts, I believe. So here is the frequencies listed over here and the channels, and then also the power authorization for each channel as well. Now, each channel has an authorized bandwidth of 12.5 kilohertz, and you will be able to transmit and receive to GMRS radio on some of the GMRS radio stations. So all of the FRS stations can communicate with GMRS radios, but there are some additional channels on the GMRS radios, and we'll talk about that here in a second. The usual range of an FRS device on channels 8 to 14 is less than 1/2 mile. So those are the half-watt channels. And the longer distance communications can be achieved on channels 1 through 7 and 15 through 22, depending on conditions. And again, that's your 2-watt channels. Okay, so General Mobile Radio Service, GMRS. I find this to be probably one of the better non-ham bands, but they all have their advantages and disadvantages, to be honest. So, okay, so we've got 30 channels on the GMRS band. It is also in the 462 to 467 megahertz range. It's UHF, and it also has that same 64 centimeter wavelength. The GMRS uses frequency modulation as its carrier wave, and it has either a 20 kilohertz or a 12.5 kilohertz bandwidth per channel. Now you can transmit voice, data, text messaging, and GPS coordinates on GMRS. So it's a little bit more, you're authorized a little bit more functionality on the GMRS band. There is a license required. There's no test. It's basically just a registration, and it currently costs $70, and that will last 10 years. And the cool thing about the license is it applies to all of the entire household family members. Again, it lasts 10 years, and few people actually get it. FCC regulations that apply to this are Title 47, Part 95, Subpart E. You can expect a communication range of anywhere from 5 to 25 miles, depending on the wattage that you're transmitting on. We'll talk more about that in a second. Call signs are issued with a license and are supposed to be utilized for transmissions, though they rarely are. The FCC antenna height is 20 feet above the structure or 60 feet above the ground, whichever is greater, though this requirement may be eliminated soon, if not already. There was a little bit of confusion when I was doing the research on this, on the current antenna height, but that was the previous guidance. So there are 8 repeater frequencies within the GMRS band, and you guys can see those there. And there are a lot of GMRS repeaters around the United States, so it might be worthwhile for you to look up which ones are in your area if you decide to use GMRS radios as a part of your preps. Okay, so the 462 and 467 megahertz main channels, the transmitter output power of mobile, repeater, and base stations must not exceed 50 watts. And that's one of the reasons that I really like the GMRS, is because you can get more wattage and punch out a little bit further. So all these colored bands here you see are the 50 and 15 watt channels. And then those are the main channels. And then you have the 462 megahertz interstitial channels. That's the white ones here. Those are limited to 5 watts. So still a good wattage, and it's still going to help you get more distance, but considerably less, obviously, than 50 watts. So let's see here. The 467 megahertz interstitial channels are limited to 0.5 watts. So it's a little confusing, but most of the radios are going to, automatically, if they're pre-programmed GMRS radios, they're going to know what they can transmit on and all that kind of thing. So you may not necessarily have to know that, but I thought that it was good to include it so that you could see why the GMRS band is a good potential band. If you got a 50 watt radio, then you're going to be in a good antenna. You're going to be able to get out there a little bit further than some of these other ones. Okay, so the multi-user radio service, or MURS. There are 5 channels in this band. They are between 151 megahertz and 154 megahertz. Now this is in the VHF band, so it's a little lower on the frequency scale. The wavelength is approximately 1.95 meters. And interestingly enough, it can use, depending on the radio that you have and how old it is and that kind of thing, there are some that have an AM carrier wave and some that have a narrowband FM carrier wave on the first 3 channels. I thought that was interesting. I didn't realize that, but MURS is authorized 5 channels, and these were previously in the industrial and business radio service band. License is not required. It's limited to 2 watts on all channels, and the FCC guidelines for antenna height are 20 feet above the structure or 60 feet above the ground, whichever is greater. The usual communication range for MURS stations, according to the FCC, is less than a few miles, but if you connect a MURS radio to an external antenna, you might extend that range out to 10 miles or more. Okay, so the NOAA weather radio. NOAA weather radio is an all hazards. It's a nationwide network radio stations broadcasting continuous weather information directly from the nearest National Weather Service office. The NWR broadcasts official weather service warnings, watches, forecasts, and other hazard information 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It also acts as an emergency alert system, and it uses a FM carrier wave. It has 7 channels that are in the frequency range of 162.4 megahertz and 162.550 megahertz in the VHF band. Now, this is a receive-only station. You cannot transmit on this frequency. And if you do purchase one, here's a picture of one like I have just sitting next to my bed, then you want to get one that has the specific area message encoding, and that helps to narrow down the transmissions that you get just to the ones that are applicable to your area. So that's kind of nice. And then here's a listing of those frequencies again, and you might want to write those down and keep them in your binder. Okay, Citizens Band Radio Service, the old CB, breaker. All right, so let's see. We've got 40 channels here in the CB band, 26.965 megahertz to 27.405 megahertz range. This is in the high frequency and 11 meter band. It's got 10 kilohertz bandwidth per channel, and the wavelength, like I said, is 11 meters. The CB uses amplitude modulation. It's an AM carrier wave. Channel 9 is reserved for emergency communications only. All channels are required to give priority to emergency communications. So for personal or business use, no license is required. Transmission length is limited to 5 minutes, then wait 1 minute, and then you can transmit another 5 minutes again. The channels are limited to 4 watts of power, except for the single sideband channels, which are allowed up to 12 watts of power. And single sideband has a pretty good ability to reach great distances, especially if you've got a good night with getting a skip off of the ionosphere. So this is also a great radio for preppers to have, because you may be able to receive information from greater distances away. And let's see, antenna height, again, 20 feet above the highest point in the building or tree, wherever it's mounted, or 60 feet above the ground. Unless you're close to an airport, then they're a little bit lower. Check the FCC guidelines for more information on that. And then also pseudonyms are allowed. So, breaker, this is big ducky, whatever. You don't have to use a call sign, basically, is what I'm saying here. All right. That movie Convoy, do you guys ever see that? It's a great movie. All right, here we go. Amateur radio service. We're not going to get too deep into ham, like we said earlier, but a license is required. It is a proctored test. There are 3 license classes: the technician, the general, and the amateur extra. Additional frequencies and privileges are granted with higher licenses. The license test fee is $15. The license is good for 10 years. And this is an interesting point. You may not transmit on GMRS, FRS, MURS, or CB frequencies with a ham radio. A lot of people don't know that, and they think that it's okay to program a ham radio, like the Baofeng UV5Rs or whatever, to transmit and receive on the GMRS frequencies. Technically, that is illegal. Okay, and the reason is those are not Part 95 compliant radios, and therefore it's not legal. At least that's my understanding. Call signs are issued with a license, and they're supposed to be utilized with each transmission. Now, just for the technician's class, the lowest class, you are authorized to transmit in the 23 centimeter, the 33 centimeter, and the 70 centimeter band in the UHF band. Then you're also allowed to transmit in the 1.25 meter, the 2 meter, and the 6 meter. And then for the HF range, you can go in the 10 meter band, and then you can do Morse code or continuous wave in the 15 meter, 40 meter, and 80 meter bands. Okay, so using handheld radios. We have only got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6 more slides. Okay, so using handheld radios. What you want to do is you want to hold the radio about 6 to 12 inches from your mouth, kind of like the guy in the picture is doing right here. You want to keep the antenna oriented in an upright position, and you want to mentally prepare your thoughts before transmitting. The next thing is you want to try to transmit from a high point in the terrain, a building roof, or an open area to get maximum distance. Transmitting from inside buildings or vehicles reduces the range and reception clarity dramatically. You want to hold the push to talk button for a second before beginning to speak, and then wait a second before responding as well. Give a little bit of break in between each transmission. That's going to help you from stepping on other people. You want to keep transmissions to 15 to 30 seconds if possible. If you're going to make a long transmission, just say break after about 15 to 30 seconds at the end of your sentence. Then let the push to talk go, and then go ahead and push it back in and start again and continue your transmission. So for example, you'd say blah, 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 break, let off the push to talk, press the push to talk again, blah, 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 and then say over when your transmission is done. The reason that's important to know is so that if somebody stops transmitting for a second after they say break, then you don't come back and start to, try to cut their transmission off. You want to speak clearly and enunciate words in plain English and use a phonetic alphabet like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, etc. To spell out important key points if the reception is bad. It's especially important if the reception is bad, but you can use them pretty much any time. You want to say Roger if the message is received clearly, or say repeat last if the message is broken or unreadable. Say over to indicate that you're finished speaking and it's the other person's turn to speak. And then say out or out here to indicate that the conversation is finished. Or you could say over and out if you were the last one to talk. Also, you want to make sure you have extra batteries with you because I promise you they will die at the worst possible time. Okay, some common radio use mistakes is speaking as you're pushing the push to talk button. This happens a lot. People will start to engage the button right as they start to talk because they think it's an instantaneous thing. And while it is very, very fast, it really helps with clarity if you give it a half second or a second or so before you start to talk. Transmitting from poor locations with no line of sight. This happens a lot. People will pick up a radio and just start to transmit without thinking where they're standing and what's around them. You got to think about that because that's the biggest thing that's going to affect how far your radio transmission is going to go. holding the mic right next to your mouth and with the antenna pointed in some kind of a weird direction, kind of turn it to the side or something along those lines, that is a bad habit to get into. The other thing a lot of people do is they reply too quickly before the other person is finished talking. Then they start to jump in there, and that will just cut them off, and it causes a lot of confusion. And the last thing is not thinking about what you're going to say before you reply, because you end up doing a lot of ums and hums and and verbal pauses and stuff, and that gets hard to understand when you're in a critical situation. So you want to think about what you're going to say before you transmit. Okay, so this I think is a great little radio plan here. I think it's important to share it so that people understand and know when to get on their radio to communicate with other preppers during a disaster. So the 333 radio plan is a communication schedule that was devised in a similar fashion to the rule of threes. Its purpose is to make it easy for preppers and survivalists to remember. This plan will help you make contact with other preppers in an SHTF situation. So, first thing is when to transmit or when to listen and transmit. You want to turn your radio on every 3 hours. That's at the 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock. You want to do this 3 minutes before the top of the hour until 3 minutes after the top of the hour. And as a general rule, use channel 3. Okay, how long to listen? So we kind of covered this, but it's important. As a minimum, you want to listen for 3 minutes before the top of the hour until 3 minutes after the top of the hour in case there's any time differences between you and the other people who are trying to listen and transmit. That way you don't miss a transmission. However, if you have plenty of battery life, you should bump that up to probably 10 minutes before the hour and 10 minutes after the hour. Remember to synchronize your watch if you happen to make contact with anyone so you'll know when they come on next time. Now, what channels to use? We're going to talk about that more in detail in the next couple of slides, but channel 3 usually applies for CB, the FRS and GMRS shared channels, or the MURS frequency. With the ham, the 2 meter band, or the 146.520 megahertz is a good channel as well. Okay, so for common prepper frequencies, here are some of the ones that you're going to want to put in your emergency binder or keep track of in some way, shape, or form. And again, FRS and GMRS, the shared freaks, that's going to be channel 3, which is 462.6125. Again, 462.6125. Then on GMRS only, you've got channel 17, which is 462.6. You've also got GMRS channel 20, which is 462.675. And then on MURS, channel 3, which is 151.940. And CB channel 3, which is 26.985. And CB channel 9 could also be considered one. And then you've got CB, the single side band, which is channel 36, and the frequency is 27.365. And channel 37 on the single side band, which is 27.375. Okay, and here is a whole list of other frequencies as well. It also includes the ham frequencies, some marine frequencies, and those kind of things. And I have included a download on this lesson where you can just print this whole thing out and just keep that whole sheet in your binder. Okay, here are some militia frequencies, and these are the frequencies that are kind of the well-known militia and prepper and survivalist frequencies. And the reason that I'm showing this is because there's some overlap. So we have the militia patriot channels on the left, and then we have the SHTF kind of survival and prepper frequencies on the right. And there's some overlap in these frequencies here where these arrows are. And the reason I point that out is because maybe you want to speak with those people, depending on who they are and what their ethics and morals are. but maybe you don't want to, and maybe you don't want them hearing your transmissions, depending on how things shake out and all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to point out that there's some crossover there, and it might be important to know. So keep that into consideration. Okay, 3 more slides. This is the we got last 3 here, and we're done. Whew, already 49 minutes in. That's crazy. Okay, so direction finding. This is really important if we were ever in a situation where, let's say, there was a foreign invasion, okay, and we were having to fight a foreign government because the U.S. forces were engaged, in other parts of the country, and we had to defend our homeland from, say, the Chinese or something silly like that, okay? We want to know about direction finding because direction finding is a process by which a person can use specific radio equipment to determine the specific location of a radio transmission, meaning that if they have the right equipment, they can locate where you're transmitting from. Now, depending on the equipment being used, this can be done in one transmission or several. If a force has established a permanent presence in the area, then they may try to establish fixed point direction finding equipment. If they're new to an area, then they may still be using mobile direction finding equipment. So it all kind of depends. Here is an example in this diagram up here of fixed point direction finding equipment. They have 3 different stations laid out here. And what happens if you're over here and you make your transmission, then they can identify the general area where you're at. It's very similar to triangulating on a map with a map and compass. It gives you basically a certain area of which they'll be reasonably certain that transmission came from. So the reason this is important is because if you're operating in a tactical situation, it's important to remember that many hostile nation states have the ability to direction find radio transmissions. If you're in a combat situation, you should never transmit from your home location. Let me say that again. You should never transmit from your home location, okay, if you're in a combat situation. Now, you can listen. You can listen all you want. They can't direction find if you're just listening, but the moment that you key up, they can identify if somebody was close enough, and if they had the right equipment, they could identify where you're at. Okay, what you want to do is you want to always move to a remote area far from your home before transmitting. Then move out of that location quickly. And then, because they could send out a quick reaction force or something like that to try to find you. So this is a pain, right? This is not, not an ideal situation, but it's an important thing to think about if you were fighting a more sophisticated force, especially somebody who is technologically sophisticated. Here's just a quick look at what a mobile, or type of direction finding equipment might look like down there. Okay, so lower wattage radios are going to be harder to be detected by DFing. Higher wattage radios can be DF'd from longer distances away. So therefore, for tactical communications, it is better to have lower wattage handheld radios if you're in an environment where direction finding is a threat. Some radios have the ability to change the power settings as well, and that might be important to know. Maybe at certain points when you're trying to reach out there, you want to have it on a higher power setting, but when you're doing a tactical, operation, you want to have that on a lower setting. It just depends. So it's just something to think about, just kind of food for thought, Keep that in mind because direction finding is a real thing. Okay, so radio jamming. Radio jamming is a process by which a user overloads the airways with noise and thereby occupies the frequency so that it cannot be utilized by anyone else. And these are just a couple of pictures of some examples of what jammers might look like. Many times you'll see they'll have multiple antennas coming off the top of the equipment. Okay, and here's the thing. In hostile environments, many forces will jam known enemy frequencies to determine, to deny their adversary the ability to utilize your radio. So if you pick up your radio and you hear constant noise on most or all of your channels, then there is a high likelihood that it's being jammed. So that's important to know. If there are specific frequencies that appear to still be open, be careful using those, because those frequencies are likely being monitored. Consider using coded messages if you find yourself in a situation like that. And this is another good reason why it's important to have multiple different types of radios, multiple different bands, so that you can select different options if one happens to be getting jammed. But yeah, be careful on that. If you've got one or two frequencies that are still open, the chances are they're leaving those open so they can listen in. They're essentially forcing you to use those specific frequencies that they're monitoring. So just something to think about. Okay, that is it. Holy cow, we got it done in less than an hour. So in summary, we talked a little bit about the lesson's intent. We took a look at the radio wave basics, how a radio works, basic radio terminology, radio frequency ranges, how radio waves travel differently, radio wave propagation, line of sight, repeaters, types of radio bands for preppers, using handheld radios, common radio use mistakes, the 333 radio plan, or the prepper radio plan, some militia and prepper radio frequency crossover, and then direction finding and jamming. So I hope you guys found this useful. There's a lot packed into this lesson. We might have called it radio 201 instead of 101, but I think it's important to lay this foundation down, because the use of radios is a huge force multiplier for preppers, and it's important that you take advantage of that, especially if we ever found ourselves in a homeland defense kind of situation. But there's a lot to know and a lot to consider. So if you guys have got any questions, then please put those questions in the comments below, or you can email me directly at americanpreppingacademy@protonmail.com, and I'll try to do my best to answer your questions. Thanks a bunch, guys. I really appreciate your support on Patreon. You guys are the ones who keep me motivated to do this and to share this kind of information. And I hope that you take this information and share it with other people so that they can learn from it and stuff like that as well. So thanks a bunch, and don't forget to live the 6 Ps. Proper prior preparation prevents poor performance. Stay safe, guys.